this is posturing by the North Koreans. I think they're trying to do a little bit of shaking the American side up.
If you really stay on this Libya model concept, it ain't going to work.
In the face of North Korean resistance, how would the United States be able to pursue still the civic goal?
The Trump model will settle on, with the North taking certain initial steps, the United States returning some favors.
North Korea really wants the bomb. And denuclearization to them is a very long, protracted process.
We're not going to go into a negotiation where we have to drag this out a long time.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jang Cho. President Donald Trump laid out a choice for North Korea: denuclearize and get protections, or follow the path of Libya and be decimated. This follows North Korea's threat to cancel the summit between Presidents Trump and Kim Jong-un. Today, we take a look at how the U.S. should deal with North Korea returning to its old playbook.
Continuing to move forward with the preparations at this point.
And he'll get protections that will be very strong.
My guest today, Mr. Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Mr. O'Hanlon has been focusing on U.S. defense strategy and national security policy for the past 30 years. Also joining us today, Mr. Dennis Wilder, professor at the Georgetown University. Mr. Wilder was senior director at the National Security Council during the Bush administration and spent more than 3 decades at the CIA. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks very much.
Nice to be here.
Morning. Dennis, let me begin with you. So is the summit still on? What is the indication from Washington?
Absolutely, the summit is still on. The president, I think, yesterday made it very clear that the preparations are still going on, that the United States and the North Koreans are still in communication on all of this. So I think this is posturing by the North Koreans. I think they're trying to do a little bit of shaking the American side up, putting Trump on his back heel, if you will, going into the summit. I don't think they're planning to cancel at this point.
Michael, how did you see it? Is North Korea blustering?
Well, I'm glad to hear Dennis's confidence. I mostly agree with it. I think there is a small chance that Kim Jong-un has decided that the Trump team is so committed to an absolutist and immediate denuclearization path that there's no point in having a summit. But my guess is that Kim is hoping to actually get into a negotiation with quid pro quos and trying to send a message to the Trump team: if you really stay on this Libya model concept, it ain't going to work. And let's get that very clear. And if you keep insisting that the Libya model is the only one that could be worth considering here, the summit's pointless, and maybe we should cancel it. But my guess is that both sides will recognize there are a lot of things to talk about, even without the Libya model being within reach. And therefore, I tend to agree with Dennis that it will happen. But, you know, I hate to predict the future, especially when Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump are involved.
Michael, President Trump seemed to walk back from the Libya model yesterday. How did you see that? Was it a good move?
Well, I think the Libya model does not apply because Libya didn't have nuclear bombs. It didn't have a huge developed infrastructure. And by the way, the issue there was not whether we invaded Libya or not, but whether we lifted the sanctions, which had been imposed over terrorism in the first place. So, entirely different case. John Bolton was trying to make a dramatic play by invoking this example, but it really wasn't a good analogy. So yes, President Trump, to the extent that he wants a summit and that he wants this to be a success and that he agrees with what Dennis said, he's going to have to find a different way to talk about it, and he's a smart enough negotiator to do that. On the other hand, he also is known for putting out extreme positions and then gradually walking them back. So I wouldn't be surprised if he brings the Libya model up again, you know, but I think he knows that it's not a realistic approach in this case, but he still likes the idea of making maximalist demands at the beginning and then seeing where he can get.
Dennis, Senator Sanders said that this is a Trump model. Do you think the Trump administration has a Trump model for North Korea already?
I think that I see a model developing on the Trump administration side. I don't know that I would call it a completely solidified model at this point. One of the problems this administration has had in many areas is message consistency. And we're seeing it on North Korea with Bolton saying one thing and Secretary Pompeo saying another. I think the Trump administration, at least I would say Secretary Pompeo, understands that you can't ask the North to completely denuclearize before giving them some incentives. So in that regard, I think the Trump model will settle on some sort of quid pro quos, with the North taking certain initial steps, the United States returning some favors and moving on that way. But I also think that the Trump administration, if there's anything to the Trump model, it's that we're not going to go into a negotiation where we have to drag this out a long time. I think the Trump administration, some in the administration say, we need this completed by 2020. That's interesting because, of course, that's when the president will run for re-election. So they want a quick process.
Michael, North Korea laid out its position on denuclearization in the latest statements. What was most notable to you?
Well, what's most notable to me over the years is that North Korea really wants the bomb. And denuclearization to them is a very long, protracted process that involves a lot more than just them giving up their weapons. As Dennis points out, it involves incentives, and some of those would be economic, some of those could be diplomatic, some of those would be military on our side. And I don't really think that they mean literally that they're willing to denuclearize, certainly not by 2020. But if President Trump is willing to be a little flexible in his definition, then he might be able to get the success in his first term. So, for example, if you define denuclearization as eliminating the infrastructure that's needed to make bombs and fissile material, and North Korea still gets to keep some of its weapons, but it's promised by 2040 to give them up, as long as a lot of other things happen along the way. You can call that, if you want, a denuclearization plan. The chance that a North Korean regime that has spent so many years building up its nuclear capability would give it up entirely in a couple of years is very low. And don't forget, when you talk about the Libya model, for the North Koreans, the Libya model is Gaddafi made a mistake. He had a problem with the United States, and he did not have a nuclear weapon to protect him. Saddam Hussein made the mistake of being in a bad relationship with the United States without nuclear weapons. The Taliban made a mistake, same thing. All three of those groups overthrown, all three of their leaders dead. Kim Jong-un is not going to fall victim to the same fate.
Dennis, although Michael said it'll be difficult, still the goal for the U.S. government is CVID, CVID.
Right.
So how, in the face of North Korean resistance, how would the United States be able to pursue still the CVID goal?
It's not a question of whether you can achieve a long-term denuclearization that gets you pretty close to CVID. That is probably doable in the long term if trust is built between the United States and the North Koreans. If Kim wants to keep some fissile material in a mountain somewhere, we're going to have great difficulty finding that. And so I think that 100% verification is a pipe dream. But as you go down this process, ideally, you create more and more trust between the two sides. One of the reasons, as Michael said, that it's very unlikely Kim will completely denuclearize in the next decade is we have no trust. There is no trust built between the United States and North Korea. In fact, there's a huge amount of distrust. So I think you've got to see a slow process, hopefully with some quick successes up front to build some confidence between the two sides. But you can work toward this goal, even if you can't achieve it in the near term.
Can I give an example of that? I agree very much.
Yeah.
A very fast transformation in U.S. relations with a communist country was the path with Vietnam. And if you think about that, it's hard to imagine that going any faster than it did. And it took about 20 years. from the end of the Vietnam War to the period of the John McCains of the world visiting Vietnam and the beginning of a diplomatic détente and actually good relations for the most part. We still don't prefer Vietnam's form of government. We wish they weren't communist. We still think their human rights record is not great. But they've made so much progress in so many ways, and they've been so open to us and we've forgiven them in many ways. So I think that was about as fast as I could ever imagine this kind of thing happening, and it took 20 years. Kim Jong-un is probably not going to change as fast as the Vietnamese. So it's probably going to take more than 20 years to really build trust. That would be just one point of reference that I would invoke.
Dennis, what was interesting to me this week was that this back and forth between Kim Kye-kwan and Bolton, Ambassador Bolton, and you were at the NSC during the Bush administration.
Right.
So what's this dynamic? I think you would know.
Well, I think, first of all, the North Koreans, speaking of trust, have had a lot of experience watching John Bolton and his attitude toward them. There's no question that he's a North Korea hawk, that he really does believe that any deal with the North Koreans cannot be verified and that they will cheat and that they won't live up to their commitments. So he's got a pretty strong track record that Kim Kye-kwan knows well, having negotiated with Chris Hill and then watching the dynamic back in Washington, where Bolton was part of that group that was constantly questioning anything that Chris Hill brought home. So I think the North, when they saw him out on television on Sunday, I think they were quite alarmed to see that he was willing to go out there and take a very hardline stance. And what they want to do is send a very clear message to President Trump that you better be listening to Secretary Pompeo and not the National Security Advisor, because we're never going to trust the National Security Advisor, and we want to deal with Pompeo, who clearly they have some degree of good feeling toward at this point.
Michael, last question, just briefly. President Moon Jae-in is coming to DC soon. What will be the goal, objective between President Trump and President Moon?
Well, I don't know what it will be, but I think what it should be is to develop a realistic kind of roadmap for negotiations. And I have a sort of think of it in 4 phases. Right now we're freezing the testing, or the North Koreans are freezing the testing. That's good, but it's a very small step. And we need to see an actual cap on their production of fissile material. It's verifiable, as well as can be verified. That's the second step. And we can give a little bit to North Korea at that point. Third step is to start dismantling the centrifuges and the plutonium separation and production facilities. That's when we can start to be more generous. And the fourth phase is the disarming, the actual return of fissile material to some international custodianship. I hope they talk about that sort of detail and what kind of incentives and what kind of relaxation of restrictions we could have towards North Korea at each step along the way.
We'll end this conversation here and watch video for our next discussion.
남조선 전역에서 우리를 겨냥하여 벌어지고 있는 이번 훈련은 판문점 선언에 대한 노골적인 도전이며 좋게 발전하는 조선반도 정세 흐름에 역행하는 고의적인 군사적 도발이다.
Now, while North Korea threatened to scuttle the summit with President Trump, it actually canceled high-level talks with South Korea. North Korea cited objections to joint U.S. RK Air Force drills, Max Thunder, saying they're a rehearsal for invasion. Michael, what is Max Thunder? Is it a preemptive strike against North Korea, as North Koreans say?
Well, I think your footage was very good, because what the footage showed was probably the bombing of artillery positions. And as Combined Forces Command has historically thought of a possible war, what we've assumed is that many of the 1,000 to 2,000 long-range artillery that North Korea has near the DMZ would, in the early hours of a war, be fired into the city where you grew up in Seoul, and which all of us love so much. What that means is if you've got 1,000 artillery tubes, and it's probably more than that, but if you had, let's say, 2,000, you've probably got to drop 2,000 precision bombs. And so this is going to take a while, because we probably only have a couple hundred planes in Allied inventory that are capable of that kind of precision strike on the Korean Peninsula today. so they'd each have to drop on average 10 bombs or more to achieve this goal. It takes a lot of quick coordination. I think of this as defensive because it presupposes that North Korea is shelling Seoul.
Let me add one thing to that. The North Koreans seem to have picked up on press reporting in South Korea and elsewhere that there would be B-52s involved in this exercise. The Pentagon has come out and said that was untrue, that that was not part of the plan. And B-52s are pretty provocative because of the obvious nuclear capability that the B-52s have. So I think there was an overreaction to this exercise given bad information on what the U.S. was planning to do.
Now, Michael, senior advisor to South Korean President Moon Jae-in, his name's Moon Jung-in, he actually earlier this month questioned the fate of U.S. troops in South Korea, and now he's questioning the alliance itself. He said that it is unnatural, and the best thing is to get rid of an alliance, and the alliance should be transformed into multilateral security cooperation regime. What is your reaction?
Well, first, I think that the fuller context of what he was talking about was once we have resolved the nuclear and other standoffs with North Korea. He's looking to the longer distance future. Whether a close advisor to the president ought to be saying that right now can be debated, because it almost sounds like he wants to give too much away, and he's almost inviting Kim Jong-un to try to explore differences in opinion between South Korea and the United States. What would be the need for an alliance if we ever got to the point where the North Korean threat was gone? And frankly, it's going to be a big choice at that moment for South Korea. Do they think that having an ongoing relationship with a distant superpower is good for their position in the world? And then for both of us, South Korea and the United States, can we redefine the alliance in a way that others in the region would not see it as a threat? I'm not sure we should get rid of it, though, because the United States and the Republic of Korea, we have done amazing things together. We are really good allies for each other.
Right,
and the
course.
idea of giving that up lightly would, I think, be tragic in some ways, or certainly a big potential loss for the benefit of both countries.
Dennis, what are your thoughts?
Once the threat from the North is reduced or eliminated. We love the alliance structure of East Asia. We think it has served the United States extremely well. This is something really at the geostrategic level that will need to take time and discussion, and to make sure, frankly, that South Korean leaders of both sides of the spectrum are in agreement on this, because you don't want to end the alliance and then get a change in government in South Korea and find that they want the alliance again. So I think a consensus has to form in South Korea, and I don't believe that consensus exists today.
Well, we'll have to end it here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment, a time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today, we have a picture of a former North Korean diplomat to Britain who defected to the South in 2016. Mr. Tae Young-ho held a press conference for his memoir. In his memoir, Mr. Tae described North Korean leader Kim as impatient, impulsive, and violent. Now, Michael, what's your reaction to this photo?
Well, I think it's a good reminder of the nature of the regime we're dealing with. And Mr. Kim has been extraordinarily successful with his charm offensive, starting with roughly the Olympic Games. But he's still a man who's had his half-brother assassinated, as best we can tell. His father-in-law, many other people fell asleep during his speeches, met a pretty bad fate. We got to not get carried away in our hopes that somehow the summit, love fest is going to carry through.
Dennis?
And I think his insights are very valuable. One of the things that always disturbs professionals like myself is when a leader like Kim comes for a summit and everybody says, oh, look how nice he is, look how friendly he is. Well, Stalin could look friendly at moments. Hitler loved his dogs. This leader in North Korea is sadistic. And any man who would kill his uncle and would kill his half-brother, you have to ask what kind of individual this is.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Dennis, Michael, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.